Well, welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I hope you've all been well fed and watered. We're going to kick straight into our next session this afternoon. But I'm going to remind everyone that we've all got these on our tables. And I believe if you press them different times, you're going to have a light up here. We are going to come to you for some questions, and do feel free to pop this into the air, and we will come to you for questions. We'll have a bit of a fun with that, as well as putting them onto the app as well. Anyway, I'll stop waving that around. Our next session this afternoon, From Soil to Shore, Exploring Land and Sea Use Change in Modern Agriculture. The changing dynamics of land and sea use are being driven by the intersecting pressures of climate change, market competition, and growing public expectations. This session will explore how terrestrial and coastal ecosystems are impacted and managed while balancing productivity, sustainability, and community interests. To facilitate this session, I am delighted to introduce Ben Fargher. Now, Ben is the lead for sustainability in Cargill's ag and trading business in Asia. He's responsible for a customer-focused sustainability portfolio, including sustainability and decarbonisation programs in row crops and tropical oils. He's also the country representative for Cargill in Australia. Before Cargill, though, Ben worked as the GM of operations for a publicly listed cotton and grain agribusiness, and was also previously the CEO of the NFF. I'll now pass over to Ben to introduce the keynote for this session and his panellists. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Claire. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I am on. In fact, I'm going to stand up. Why not? I was just talking to Di before. She said, you look like you're running a TED talk with this microphone. I don't love these microphones, but I might as well stand up and I can see people because it's a long room. So look, welcome. Before I introduce my panel, and we're going to have a speaker as well, I thought I would set some ground rules. Which have not been cleared by ABARES, by the way, but when they get you to facilitate a panel, you get to set your own ground rules. So here we go. The first ground rule is, you've all been on panels, I'm sure. If you don't ask a question, either online or from the floor, I am going to ask these guys questions for 1 hour. And I've got good questions. I'm interested. And in fact, I don't know a lot about some of these issues around particularly forestry and fishery. It's not my area of expertise. So I've got questions, but it's not necessarily what you want to hear about. So please ask questions. And in that regard also, there are no stupid questions. I don't live in Canberra. I used to. I don't live there anymore. I don't know half the acronyms in this town that I used to know. I'm not going to use any acronyms today, and I'm going to challenge my fellow panellists not to either, because we often just assume in this world that we know these acronyms. We've got Nuffield scholars here, we've got people online. I don't know where the audience is from. Let's assume they don't know the acronyms. And in that regard, please ask open, challenging questions. I've talked to the panel. They want to be challenged and look forward. They don't want to just talk about the micro minutiae of their sector. So please, let's have that culture and do that today. We'd really appreciate it. What's going to happen is we're going to have a speaker. I'm about to introduce him. I'll introduce the panel first. He's going to speak, David, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we're going to open it up from questions. I'll start with a couple to break the ice. And then please wave the whatever you call that, Claire, thing, and we'll ask questions, and Claire's going to help me online as well. So with that background, I'm going to introduce Sloan from the Fisheries Research Development Corporation. And Sean's got a big background in fisheries. He's worked in it for a long time. We've only just met. He's worked in it not just nationally, but also in various states, and I read from your bio in the Pacific Islands, Solomon, as well. So a big expertise, and I'm looking forward to hearing from him because it's not an area of our important sector that I know a lot about. Di Hallam from the Australian Forestry Products Association. Di and I worked together maybe 20 years ago, maybe longer. It's good to see you, Di. And I had more hair. Thanks, Di. You can see the culture in our panel has started early. So with that introduction, Di has worked in the public sector, in the political side of the sector in agribusiness in this town and in corporate Australia for many, many years, and also has a background practically and also now with her family in agriculture. And so it'll be great to hear from Di about the challenges, small challenges, opportunities, lots of opportunities in forestry. Tony Mahar, who will be known to many people in this room, is the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner. That's right. That was not easy. I practiced that. Tony and I have also known each other for a long time because before that important role, Tony was the CEO of the National Farmers Federation, did an excellent job, certainly did a much better job than some of his predecessors. As a role I used to have. So welcome Tony, and what an important issue, that interface, particularly in regard to renewables and energy infrastructure at the moment. And last but not least, and your esteemed speaker for today is David Galeano from ABARES, who runs the Natural Resources Division, as I understand it, of ABARES, and has a long background and expertise in the public service. He's a long tenured expertise, but certainly has maintained his health through a diversity of food choices, no doubt. And so David's going to give us a 10-minute speech about some of the dynamics to set up the conversation, but he's also got a background in water, importantly, which I'm not sure we've heard a lot about today, but is vitally important to this discussion. And so welcome, David, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I had a little panic attack there with acronyms. I'm not sure how many I've got in my talk, so best endeavours, yeah. Anyway, thanks, Ben. And yeah, today I'll set the scene for this session. So let me try and get this thing up and running. Here we go. So land and sea use change has received its fair share of media attention of late. Media does portray land and sea use change often quite negatively, focusing on the loss of farmland or fishing grounds. So I'll talk today about what land and sea use change might mean for our fisheries, native forestry and farming sectors, including some new work that we've done on land use change associated with net zero. Dealing with these challenges will help set the sector up for the future to best take advantage of a changing landscape. But first, the perspective I'd like to bring to this panel discussion is that this is essentially a resource allocation challenge. There's various ways resources can be allocated across society, but typically in Australia, this is done via the market, with competition meaning those willing to pay the most get the access. Now, it probably won't surprise you as an economist. I'm kind of fond of competition. I think it's a good thing in principle as it helps improve aggregate outcomes across society. But there's often angst about competition because the outcomes or how resources end up being allocated across society can result in winners and losers. And this is where the conflict can arise. Economists have often struggled to deal with these sorts of distributional issues, but they're real, and if they're significant enough, can undermine welfare improving progress. There's also some potential market failures here, where markets will suboptimally not take account of things that society actually desires. An example might be increased water interceptions from more trees in the landscape. These might require government attention to help smooth changes in land and sea use change over time, but care is required intervening in markets, as there's almost always trade-offs, and I'll come back to that a little later on. So we recently released some modelling on how much land might be required for sequestration under the Treasury net zero modelling scenario. The Treasury modelling anticipated that land-based sequestration, which is trees growing, absorbing CO2 in the landscape, might be 119 million tonnes by 2050. Now, I won't go through the technical details of how our model works, but it essentially allows landholders to decide whether to sequester carbon via environmental plantings or manage regeneration or produce agricultural commodities like crops and livestock. And it simply does this by considering the economics and the risks associated with the various outputs. So what are the results? Well, about 18 million hectares might be required under these projects, with roughly half being environmental plantings and the other half human-induced regeneration projects, which are essentially about keeping stock out for long enough to allow regrowth. We estimate landholders will invest where it makes sense for them to do so, where the profits from producing carbon outweigh the profits from ag commodities. In our results, about 45% is in the pastoral zone, which accounts for about 15% of the carbon sequestered, with the remainder being in the wheat sheep zone and high rainfall zones. And about half is in the Murray-Darling Basin. But of course, like a lot of things, there's a bit of nuance here. It's not just a one or the other proposition. In our model, we allow agriculture to coexist with carbon plantings. This can be either via partial conversion of properties, or in the case of human-induced regeneration, allowing stock to re-enter after exclusion periods. We say over half the cells in our model are partially converting, meaning that agriculture and carbon plantings can coexist. The value of agriculture is only expected to be impacted by about 2% in 2050 in this scenario compared to the no sequestration scenario. And given underlying growth in demand, we're still expecting agriculture to continue to grow out to 2050, albeit slightly lower than what it would otherwise have been. And there's significant benefits to landholders, and this makes sense because conversion is voluntary, and we'd only expect a farmer to convert if they thought they were going to be better off and make higher profits. And our modelling suggests that this scenario, the benefits are in the order of about $9 billion a year by 2050. And it's also a fairly substantial diversification option for our landholders, and particularly in that pastoral zone. There's also broader benefits across the economy, given land-based sequestration is cheaper than the alternative abatement in other parts of the economy. And avoiding that more expensive abatement is worth about $7 billion a year by 2050. So this all sounds pretty wonderful, and if it is also wonderful, what's the problem? Why is land use change generating so much angst? Well, while landholders might be better off, there are other people in society who might be worse off, or who might be worried that they'll be worse off. And here's a few examples of things that we think people might be worried about. These are quite consistent with what farmers told us in one of our recent NRM surveys as well. So more work is required to determine whether these issues are material and the extent to which existing measures already address these potential concerns. It is possible that conversion of farmland to carbon plantings could result in increased pest and weed prevalence, which could impact neighbouring properties. We know from our regular pest and weed survey that pests and weeds are costing landholders about $20,000 each on average per year. Existing carbon market rules might already be enough to address this, but we think it's probably something worth looking into. Ooh, there we go. Increased water interceptions from more trees could reduce runoff into dams and rivers that could reduce water available for other users. That includes stock and domestic, irrigated agriculture and natural ecosystems. Again, existing water sharing rules might be enough to deal with this, but we think it's worth looking into. Importantly, there's also the potential for flow-on impacts to regional economies if land-based sequestration projects changes the nature and amount of inputs used on farms, and this in turn impacts those local businesses supplying those inputs. And we did some analysis of this in the recent report that we released. To show the scale of the impact, we modelled how many of the 500 plus local government areas in Australia might experience a significant first order impact on gross regional product from the 119 million tonne scenario. Now this first order impact relates to how big the reduction in agricultural revenue is in each area and how important agriculture is for each of those regions. Now it's a bit of a crude measure up front because it doesn't take account of any of the benefits that flow from carbon sequestration projects, and it also doesn't account for any changes in demand associated with the change, but we think it gives us a pretty decent starting point to look at this problem. Now given the sequestration projects are spread out and the impacts on ag revenue are generally reasonably modest, there's only a handful of LGAs where the impact is more than about 5%. Importantly, this wasn't an exercise to figure out which local government areas are in the firing line. It's more about trying to understand how big the issue might be and to estimate the costs of doing something about it if the government so desired. We looked at two types of restrictions in the model to look at to limit the amount of land use change allowed in each region. The model then would reallocate sequestration across the landscape or even to other sectors of the economy. One of these scenarios, landholders are only allowed to convert a maximum of 20% of their farm to sequestration projects. Now, this does the job of reducing the number of local government areas with first order impacts greater than 5%, but there's a significant cost. You can see here the carbon price increases as we push sequestration projects away from the least cost areas to more expensive parts of the economy. As a result, the broader benefits across the economy falls quite substantially. Now, the key takeaway from this is that there actually weren't all that many LGAs heavily impacted in the first place, and it cost you a lot to do something about it. So we think the trade-offs here are quite clear, and we need to think them through fairly carefully. So our modelling doesn't yet include the timber plantations ACU method, Australian Carbon Credit Unit method. We're working on getting that in the model as we speak. But we know there's already some of these projects, and this might fuel more competition for land between agriculture and forestry. Again, we don't think this is necessarily a bad thing in principle because it could reduce the overall cost of the transition, and it's another diversification option for our landholders. And we also know that timber plantations do benefit the regions given their ongoing transport, milling, plantation management requirements and so on. So moving on to our native forests. A contemporary issue here is whether we should stop native forest harvesting to give us a carbon benefit. Now, depending on who you listen to, this will either give us a carbon benefit or come at a carbon cost. They can't both be right, or can they? Work we're doing at the moment, we're trying to distill how it can be that different studies looking at the same problem are able to arrive at completely opposite results on whether it gives you a carbon benefit or a carbon cost. Now, like most of these things, the answer seems to depend on how you look at the problem. And we think it's boiling down to these three factors I have on the slide. First is the time horizon. So as we all know, trees can take a long time to grow and they sequester carbon over a very long period, whereas harvesting creates emissions almost immediately. But analyses over longer time horizons tend to account for more of the carbon sequestered from the regrowing trees over their long lives. And those studies therefore include native forest harvesting can give you a carbon benefit. Second is the type of analysis. Now, what I'm referring to here is really the carbon life cycle and whether the carbon emissions of alternative products that consumers will end up using, so steel, concrete, plastics and so on, whether those emissions are counted in the analysis or not. And lastly, there's a huge pile of variables that require parameter estimates. So this is things like decay rates of timber in landfill, products in use, how much carbon is stored in different types of trees, in different parts of the landscape and so on. There's a lot of these, and all these can have a big bearing on the results as well. But our view is if you take a longer time horizon and account for the full carbon life cycle, then the science shows that continuing sustainable native harvesting will often give you a carbon benefit over the long term. Shifting now to fisheries, and it's not so much about carbon, more about resource access and competition. This has been dubbed the spatial squeeze by many, with the commercial sector worried about encroachment from other marine users. So this has included increased recreational interests, establishment of marine reserves, and more recently renewable energy projects such as offshore wind farms. There's also been a highly reported case we heard about this morning in Western Australia for sustainability concerns, which has seen large closures of fishing grounds for both commercial and recreational fishers. But one example is the expansion of the marine estate from under about 10% in 1997 to over half of our marine waters in 2024. Now, not all these areas had extensive fishing occurring and they don't all prohibit all types of commercial fishing, but there are various restrictions in place. It's not to say marine reserves are bad, of course. It's been judged that society values marine reserves, so therefore we have them. But what it brings into focus for me is what a fishing property access right actually provides. Fishing rights historically have been about managing commercial fishing competition from within a fishery, not between commercial fisheries and other sectors. And many of the recent issues are about competition from outside fisheries, with commercial fishers having, or at least perceiving, to lose some of their rights. Again, these changes might improve overall outcomes across society, but there'll likely be winners and losers, so managing that will be important. So finally, what do I think the key considerations are for this panel discussion? Well, first, as I said earlier, competition is inherently a good thing. It's the mechanism that helps improve overall productivity and outcomes. It might result in changes, but we shouldn't automatically shy away from changes. But ignore those distributional impacts and market failures at your peril because they can undermine welfare-improving changes. This also includes needing to look at cumulative impacts rather than individual changes in isolation. Linked to this is having clear policy objectives and identifying any trade-offs between them. Doing things that reduce competition for one policy objective will almost always come at a cost for another. And key for people like me, researchers, policy advisors and the government is to try and understand and quantify these trade-offs. And finally, flexibility is important. In particular, what I'm talking about here is carbon market rules. It'll be important to have as many ACCU methods available as possible to help landholders engage actively in carbon markets to best suit their businesses. And Ben, I might leave it there and look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it, you setting us up, and you did not use any acronyms, which is a fantastic achievement. So look, as I mentioned before in my introduction, and I'm sorry I've got my back to some people. As I mentioned before in my introduction, the focus of this panel is to be getting access to your questions. But before I do that, I just do want to start with some questions just to make sure we set the context and we understand some of the challenges before we get into this solutions focus that we have. So I'm just going to start back the other way from David. Let me start with Tony. Now, obviously, we've heard so much about the agricultural challenge at hand, but also, of course, through Maximo and then David, broader objectives we have around energy, carbon, sequestration, and the system in which we operate. So Tony, in your new role, focusing for a moment on the challenges and the potential competition with renewable energy resources, just how much of a competitor is renewable energy to our agricultural landscape, and how do you see that pinch point in what comes across your desk, really from the communities at the moment?
Ben, I think there is a level of competition, but if you look at the numbers, the actual hard numbers probably don't tend to say there is direct competition, less so for things like comparable industries or forestry thing. That being said, there is definitely that perception of influence and negativity for the agriculture sector from renewable energy infrastructure. And I suppose to David's point, I think competition is a good thing. I think flexibility is absolutely needs to be part of that conversation. I think one of the challenges, particularly for renewable energy and perhaps for the other sectors, is that understanding of the policy and the decision-making process. That's where a lot of the angst comes in, is are things being adequately considered? And I think he made a really good point around the cumulative impact. I think that's some of the real challenges. So less direct competition, Ben, more what's the impact?
Yeah, okay. All right, good. Thanks, Tony. Di, let's go to your sector and your area of expertise, and David mentioned it a lot in his discussion. Again, we want to talk solutions, coexistence, but before that tension point, where do you see it coming to the fore most prominently in the work you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, no, a good question. But before I answer that, if I could just say, Tony, my husband, fat lamb, farm wool producer from Gunning, we've got 330 kVA transmission lines running through our place, and he would love to farm sheep under solar panels, so give me a call. But no, I look, it's really important to say Australian Forest Products Association really represents productive forestry. And I mean, I don't think forestry, I've worked in agriculture for decades, and I didn't appreciate quite the nuances of forestry. I just think you plant trees and you chop them down. By the way, that's not a bad thing, everybody, as long as you replant. So I represent productive forestry, and certainly where we find a lot of the challenges happening is with environmental plantings. So that's people just planting trees and then leaving them, locking up and leaving them. And we've certainly got some of the big resource companies buying property for that purpose, which does really challenge some of the local communities. But then secondly, I think we've also got an issue, in fact it aligns with Tony's, whereby a lot of trees are being chopped down. They're not going to productive use. They're for the purposes of securing pathways for transmission lines. And people are still saying, well, why is that good for the planet and yet some elements of my industry are not good for the environment? So there's a very big anti-native forestry sentiment. Plantations often have some water conflict. I mean, David canvassed them very well. And I think it's a case of, I just generally say to people, my brother's in horticulture. You know, his carrots take 130 days, I think. I was the daughter of a sugarcane farmer. That was a 1 to 2 year crop. My fat lambs, a little over a year. And now I'm working in industry with between a 30 and an 80 year crop, basically. So I think if we can consider them like for like, there's better acceptance. But in the meantime, there's a lot of demystifying and genuine engagement to be done. So everyone can see we're part of this, walking the same agricultural platform.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you, Di. Good insights, thank you. Now, Sean, over to you. Now, as I said before, my expertise is more on the land-based, and I thought that was complex. And until I start looking at that map with marine regulation and recreational fishing and conservation and all the plethora of issues we deal with. So where does this really come to a pinch point in your sector?
Well, David called out the spatial squeeze issue, and that's, I think, one of the major sort of challenges for the fisheries and aquaculture sector generally. The map that David showed up was, I think, spoke for itself, but that wouldn't have had all the fishing closures included. That was just marine parks or marine conservation areas. It wouldn't have included all the state level marine park areas as well. And of course wouldn't have included the offshore clean energy zones and in some cases shipping channels and those sorts of things. So it is a real challenge for the sector when we're talking about essentially a community resource and how we enable access for food production. So there's that issue when we look at then climate change and the impacts that are there on the sector. In the last few years alone, we've had a major harmful algal bloom in South Australia, which has been really quite devastating for marine ecosystems. And in fact, when you think about marine parks, that type of tool wouldn't have protected that marine ecosystem from a harmful algal bloom, which was driven by a marine heat wave, which some people talk about as bushfires in the ocean. So there's those issues. There's been major floods on the east coast. There's been coral bleaching events. There's quite a few challenges linked to climate change. So, and then there's a response, I think, from regulatory bodies to deal with some of those issues. And I think there's this added layer of regulatory burden that exists. And when you think about Australia, we import about 65% of our seafood. And so there is quite I think, a genuine food security issue at hand here when we talk about all those issues together.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a few challenges.
Yeah, so we've identified that there's a few challenges, absolutely. I want to get to solutions, but I'm going to honour the process and I'm going to go to questions before I go to my next set of questions, either online or from the floor, because I really want to make sure that we focus on what you want to talk about. So just let me stand up to see. I know I've got a question online, but let me go to the floor first. No one's waving the baton, and please do if you've got a question. But Claire, we want to talk about solutions, but let's just make sure we've got the challenges and the issues on the table. Do you have any questions online in that regard?
I do. I've got quite a few questions coming in after your presentation, David. A lot around carbon sequestration. And one of the most popular ones that have come in is, why are we focusing on trees for sequestration when mangroves and seagrasses are far more superior for carbon sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of other options as well. I didn't talk about soil carbon either. We don't have that in our model yet, and I'd expect that would be a key part of the future. We're working on getting the plantation forestry method in the model as we speak. But yeah, I think there's lots of options. It's more than just the two that we've modelled. Well and truly, there's lots of options available.
Di, do you have any comments on that? Yeah.
Because, particularly with plantation forestry, there are co-benefits. So, I mean, I represent the supply chain. So at one end, I've got the people who grow the trees, and then I've got the hardwood and softwood manufacturers, the exporters. In fact, if you are visiting Canberra, feel free to just walk directly out the front door of the Realm to Little National, and that building just there is basically made of mass engineered timber. It's, I think, 5 stories of beautiful timber, all sourced from Australia and manufactured in Australia. So with your carbon benefits, you're also getting a product and a pipeline of employment and manufacturing. That you obviously aren't getting that from mangroves and, well, environmental plantings. So yeah, productive, I think the productive agricultural elements are the ones that particularly investors are interested in.
Sure. Thanks, Di. Sean, you've got a comment on that?
Yeah, just to pick up on the mangroves, seagrasses, kelps, etc. Certainly, some of those, particularly the mangrove areas, are wetlands and they're nursery grounds for fish stocks, and there's a real, I think, opportunity there where, particularly, I think of an area like the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, where we've got these low-lying areas that, if you look at the forecasts over the next, say, 50, 100 years, sea level rise and inundation, there's an opportunity to look at creating alternative land uses for farmers that would enable them to generate income, enter carbon markets, and at the same time rehabilitate some of those areas that would give benefits for fish stocks and therefore our fisheries. And so there are some opportunities there, but obviously they rely on a whole heap of work to be done.
Yeah, sure.
Joe Shepherd's got a question.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question from the floor, please.
Hi, thank you. Joe Shepherd, Queensland Farmers Federation. I just had 2 questions, moving back to the impact piece. One was around, in the research where you found the different impacts of the tree carbon projects, was fire, increased risk of bushfire an issue? And then maybe a second question, maybe for Tony, but for all of the panel, in relation to offsets, in relation to renewable developments. In Queensland, we're seeing, I guess, a growing interest in understanding how the offset implication of developments is actually changing land use as well.
Great questions. Thank you, Joe. David?
Yeah, so we, in the modelling that we did make an allowance for some failures in some environmental plantings. I think, off the top of my head, might be 5% or thereabouts. And Di might want to comment as well about increased fire risk plantations and native, but it's definitely an issue for the plantation sector.
Yeah, no, it's. I'm really happy to advise that actually a managed forest, whether it's a managed native forest or a plantation forest, is actually less susceptible to a catastrophic wildfire than an unmanaged forest. So, and in fact, I got quizzed on this Senate inquiry recently. So a number of royal commissions into fires have declined to accept some academics' claims that forestry exacerbates wildfire. There are new insurance products on the market now whereby you have a lower premium if you are adjacent to or working in a managed forest. And I think the people who own those assets or manage those assets have an interest in preserving and protecting them. So they actually invest a lot of time and effort and money into ensuring that that doesn't occur. And I was having a bad day during my holiday in January when I was on the south coast of New South Wales, and I went into the Mogo nursery, and I apologise if the Mogo nursery owner's here, hopefully not. And he had a shirt saying, "Climate action now, stop native forest logging." And
He got more than he bargained for.
he did. But one of his arguments was, this causes worse fires, and I lost a house in the Black Summer bushfires. So I have a keen interest in this. And I said, well, actually, I'm sorry, but that's incorrect. And he said to me, oh, no. So my daughter is standing there going, oh my God, Mum, we have to get out of here. This is so embarrassing. And I said to him, he said, I've seen it from my own eyes. The fire ripped through here. And I said, yes, it did. It did race through the harvested forest. It didn't stay because of a fuel load on the ground and absolutely incinerate everything so that nothing survived. The forest actually is already regenerating. So I said, you've actually just made my point for me. And then I ran. But it's a great question, and one that we still have to work on to clarify.
Yeah, it is a great question. Thanks, Di. Now, Tony, Joe asked also a question about offsets and the landscape there. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah,
or maybe the original question too?
Probably focus on the second one. I think it's a really good question, Joe. And I suppose I'll link it back to that cumulative impact, not just the competition for land use. It's really having a holistic view of what are the impacts of renewable energy, not just per hectare or per kilometre in terms of transmission-wise. The cumulative impact for offsets in this case, I think the industry and the planning departments need to actually have a much better look at that. I don't think we're progressing our thinking enough around the overall impact of the renewable energy. We've got a really clear picture on how much space it takes up, but the cumulative impact for the community, whether it's offsets or something else, I think deserves more thinking.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Tony. And I would like to, you're not supposed to do this from the chair of the panel, but Joe, just to add a commercial production impact on your offset question as well. I work in the cropping sector a lot, and of course, we're aware of the offset markets, but we're running annual biological crops, and we want to change the rotation, and we're trying to produce canola, wheat, barley, etc. And so, at the same time, our customers want us to demonstrate that we're decarbonising the supply chain. And so how do we participate when we don't necessarily want to get involved in those 25-year offset markets? So we're doing a lot of work on that inset pathway, decarbonising of the supply chain in terms of measuring our emissions of our growers and through our supply chain, adding renewable projects to that through solar to our crush facilities so that we can have a lower footprint, but without necessarily having an offset arrangement in place. Not that I'm making a judgment on offset arrangements, just not something we're doing in that cropping system at the moment. So I think it goes again to that system that Maximo talked about this morning as distinct. And you talk about cumulative effects. Someone talked about externalities. Someone talked about the system, and you talked, David. You mentioned another, and in a different language, that system. It's like a balloon. You push it somewhere, and it moves somewhere else. In our sector, you can't just look at these things in silos. Good question, Joe. Thank you. You've set the tone for the questions from the floor. Claire, can I go back online and make sure we're respecting the audience online?
Absolutely. We've got a great question in here, which has been well liked by the room, and that is, how does the panel suggest we proactively safeguard access to adequate area of arable land for food security and economic viability without interfering in markets and individual decision making? And look, why don't I want to make sure David gave an excellent presentation, but he's on the panel too. So maybe, David, can I start with you and we'll come along?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one. The work that we did showed that it was about a 2% impact on the revenue of broadacre agricultural commodities, but that's still an impact. If you move into some soil carbon and those other things, you may not have that impact on production. But ultimately, I don't think we want to be sitting here telling farmers what they can and can't do on their properties. I mean, that's something we've got to, I think, try and avoid if we can. But at the same time, we need to avoid these, what I dub the market failures, or worry about these winners and losers. So I guess where we sit in all this in ABARES is we're trying to influence government and public debate about these things with factual analysis and evidence and all the rest of it. And the political economy kind of take over and decide where it goes. But we want to try and inform that so that those trade-offs are really clear and made openly. And rash decisions aren't made that do have an impact on food security or whatever else.
Yeah, thanks, David. Tony?
I think ABARES and other organisations play an absolutely critical role. I mean, data and evidence and informed decision making is where you want to be. And I think inherently, closet rational, dry economic rationalist, the market should rule and let's have the competition. That being said, though, I think we've seen enough, whether it's in the water market or in some other markets, deregulation has consequences that we need to be aware of and learn from. And I think, again, from my lens that I look through from a renewable energy infrastructure, the development of renewable energy zones is an intervention of sorts into the market to say, here's where we think renewable energy should go in a state, and it absolutely has to take into account the impacts on agriculture and rural and regional communities. But I think, and they're not, they're far from being perfect across the country, but at least they're a start of, there's a line on a map somewhere that says, here's where we think this should go, and David's third point, flexibility. We've got to actually have that. But I think we've seen enough with just open competition to say, well, that's nice in theory, but we've actually got to have some rules to the game.
Yeah, sure. Good point. Di, do you have a comment?
Excellent points made by both men. I was in South Australia last year for a function, and the South Australian Premier was talking to some dairy farmers who were making a valid point that you can't drink wood chips, and his response was, well, you can't sleep in milk either. It's let's not try. Let's let farmers make a decision. I always like to think, highest and best use, and I think farmers deserve a choice as to what areas of their land they think is highest and best use for them.
Yeah.
No, I don't subscribe to doctrinal, this will happen here.
Yeah. Thanks, Di. Sean, do you have a comment on that from your sector?
Probably just in relation to things like shellfish aquaculture come to mind, the oyster farming around coastal environments and some of the benefits that exist there. And if I think, say, to the South Australian situation and the algal bloom that's caused all those devastating effects, if you go back to pre-European settlement, the whole sort of Gulf systems in South Australia were lined with native oysters. They filter feed. There's efforts being done now to try and reintroduce those oysters and create habitats, and also, I guess some future resilience. And I guess we're talking about oyster farmers in this mix, so there's opportunities there to scale up some of that shellfish aquaculture around our coastal environments to improve water quality, to essentially produce food, and also create resilience to future climate change, and also sequester carbon.
Great points, and great points the panel has made. I just want to share a perspective also that when we're looking at these pinch points or competitive points and the market and people's choice and property rights, I don't think anyone in this room or on the panel would underestimate the community, the emotion, the complexity of that type of issue. And when in a previous life, when I was the CEO of NFF, people would often ask me what was the most challenging issue you dealt with, thinking telecommunications or taxation or trade policy, all extremely complex, Murray-Darling Basin. But I think in reflection that the interface between agriculture, mining, and some of the resource, energy, they were some of the most challenging because of the community impact. And I remember once, and I won't mention the location, of course, it wouldn't be appropriate to do so, or the family, but once we were at a large forum in a regional community that was talking about a mine in the area, and the community were up in arms. And we went and met with the community, and there was a discussion about regulation and rules, state, federal. It was complex and it was hot, and not temperature. And I'll never forget, we then went and toured the site where the potential mine was going to be. And the community was there, and then they were asked us to go and look at another site, and we all hopped in a vehicle to go to look at the other site. So I walked to my vehicle to hop in and follow them, and a man and a woman came up to the back of the vehicle and said to me, "Excuse me, Ben." I said, "Hello." And I'll never forget, this woman with tears in her eyes said to me, "I own this farm." And we were at a demonstration against the mine. She said, "I own this farm. I love this community. all my children have left the farm and are not coming back, and we want to sell it. So there is someone with a property right to an asset that, because of their own family consideration, wants to make or is thinking about making a decision, living in a community that they love with their friends who have opposition to a mine. Now, if you don't think that's complex for politicians, it's a real pinch point, and that's where good policy and good consultation comes in to move through that. So anyway, they're important issues, I guess, is what I'm getting at, and it's a system, like a balloon that you push somewhere, as I mentioned before. I'm looking at Maximo when I say it. So look, let's keep the questions coming. Any other questions from the floor to follow Joe's excellent question? Otherwise, Claire, have we got
We do. There's a question I thought...
any more online?
We do. We've lots coming in online. But a question here from Rob Walter, which I think all the panel will probably agree on. He says, we hear a lot about agriculture or carbon or energy, etc. How can we move towards agriculture and other uses? What can each of you do to help?
Great. Excellent. Di, why don't we start with you, and then we'll keep moving. And also, I want to learn more about blue carbon as well. This is one of my objectives of the panel today. So,
so I guess I've got two stories to tell. One is, you can Google it. They're not members of mine, but Jigsaw Farms, and they wanted to offset the emissions from their farming enterprise and cattle, and so they planted some trees, which over the course of 25 years have done exactly the job. But now those trees are basically transitioning from carbon sink to carbon source. So they've got to cut them down, harvest them, and start again. And that timber, now it's important that it goes into productive use. So it's turned into furniture, house frames. I don't quite know what they'll do with it, but that will then store the carbon in perpetuity. So some farmers have incorporated it both from an environmental perspective and from an income perspective, which I think is great. And then we've also got another situation where one of my very large members is selling 5,500 hectares in South Australia. They, under the terms of the sale, they will harvest the plantation that's on it, and they will revert the land back to agricultural use. It won't stay as a plantation because they're focused on highest and best use, and obviously they recognise that a prospective purchaser is more likely to be interested in farming for agriculture. Mm-hmm. So I think there are, we don't want to be oppositional to agriculture. We want to acknowledge either we can coexist with agriculture if that's what farmers choose to do, or we'll be good neighbours to other agricultural enterprises. That's the ambition.
Good points, Di. Sean, agriculture v carbon, or agriculture and carbon. How does that relate in a aquaculture fishery sense?
So I mentioned the wetland habitats earlier around mangroves, seagrasses, samphire habitats. They're all sort of, I guess, natural ecosystems that do sequester carbon in the mangroves, seagrasses, etc., but also in the sediments. So there's opportunities there, but there's also opportunities in food production with oysters, shellfish, mussels, and the other opportunities that flow from shellfish aquaculture around water quality. If you think about a place like New South Wales with highest sort of population density, and all of the estuaries, I think there's about 180 estuaries up and down the east coast of New South Wales. A lot of them have oyster farming in them, and all of them have water quality challenges because of rainfall events and runoff. So there's opportunities to help sequester carbon, but there's also opportunities to help improve water quality. And then if you think about kelp forests and some of the challenges that we do face with warming waters and the threat to loss of kelp, one of the examples that a lot of people know about is with purple spine sea urchins moving further south. They eat kelp, and so if we lose kelp, we lose a big opportunity to sequester carbon in the oceans. And And so there are opportunities for us to rehabilitate or replenish those kelp forests, but also introduce aquaculture for kelp products. So there's some big opportunities there that are being sort of picked up around the country.
Yeah, that is a list of opportunities. Tony, do you have a perspective on the or and question?
Yeah, I do. I have. It annoys me, the divisive, the binary discussion that people start with. I think it's already a difficult task, right? And making it one or the other is really short-sighted, and some of the commentary that we've seen, from leaders, I think is irresponsible, to be honest. Absolutely, it can coexist. There is disruption, absolutely, and we can, and I'll back the agriculture sector to manage and deal with the disruption every day of the week. That being said, we have to use a few tools around this. We absolutely have to use evidence. We have to use science. You have to use emotion. Facts don't trump emotion. So you've actually got to use empathy, and you've got to have flexibility. I'm dealing with, at the moment, case in point, a horticulture producer in the southernmost state, and some transmission lines, and it can be done, right? This can work, and the flexibility that is required in this scenario is moving in the right direction. So agriculture and transmission lines in this case can absolutely coexist, but it takes an acknowledgement of the disruption and some empathy to know what this business is dealing with, and some flexibility to say, I think we can make this work. This has to happen. What will good look like to you? How do we do it? So it's a task and it's a challenge, but I'm confident we can do it. I tell you what won't do it is binary discussions.
Yeah. Good comments. Thanks. David, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, Tony sort of stole what I was going to say about we've got to get away from this binary thing, but I'd like to think of the future as being, a farmer is growing some crops and some livestock, and they've also got some carbon plantings or some soil carbon or whatever, and we'll just think of carbon like another agricultural commodity. We won't have this divisive thing going on. So that's kind of my vision of the future. Hopefully we can get to that point one day.
Yeah, I'm passionate about that system as well. And to give another cropping example, I mean, pleasingly, a lot of the things we do for productivity can also have a sequestration benefit. And so certainly in our programs, we're not running them as carbon programs. We're running them as productivity and soils-based long-term economic sustainability programs. It's a different language. Not, of course, making judgments on people that do want to make their own decisions, to your point before, Di. But if you can optimise nitrogen use in a high nitrogen use crop like canola through technology and drive productivity and yield and lower costs and measure from a baseline a carbon, in this case, reduction outcome, then you're basically working on the and. And then if you go through a supply chain where you're working in terms of efficiency on yield of a plant, efficiency is good for business. More yield, lower cost base, but you're using renewable to do that at certain parts and measuring that through a life cycle assessment, you are lowering your emission profile of your product through the value chain. And that's a huge opportunity. And let's take canola as an example. Someone mentioned it before. That canola could be going into oil, into food, into a company, one of our customers, like Arnott's Biscuits, which is in many of the pantries in the country. Low carbon fuel to meet multiple objectives they have, but potentially that can also be going into a fuel pathway as well. So you can look at that ag v carbon, renewables v prime agricultural land, food v fuel. You could look at it like that. Or you can look at the system that integrates food, fuel pathways, farmer choice, decarbonisation, productivity, and I think that should be good enough in this country to see the opportunities from a systems-based approach, and that would be a good thing, I think. We're going well for time. Any questions from the floor? Otherwise, I'm going to keep going back to Claire because we've got a little yellow hand here that lights up with questions and I keep getting them. Joe, you've set the standard. You've asked such a good question that no one else is going to ask a question. Claire, over to you.
Well, there's just, we're really sort of coming on from the last conversation. Ben, there a lot of interest coming in, really concerning that balance between food security in light of expanding carbon markets. That seems to be a big interest area for lots of people at home and here in the audience. And the question here from Claire Boardman is, demand for land by resource companies to plant trees for carbon credits is pushing up the price of land beyond its agricultural productive value. How do family farms afford to buy more land?
Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a crack, I suppose. I mean, I covered this in my quick talk about we shouldn't necessarily shy away from competition. I mean, I know that competition can create winners and losers and angst about the outcomes, but, you know, what's the alternative? The alternative is you say, no, we're not doing that. And it gets back to being clear about what are our policy objectives and what we're trying to do. And there'll always be trade-offs here. And you can't escape that. You know, there's no free lunch with any of this stuff. So I think what we need to be is really clear about what our policy objectives are, and everything kind of flows from there.
Yeah, I mean, there was a great episode on Landline last year featuring, in fact, shout out to John Lawson from Midway down there, who is a carbon expert, by the way. If anyone wants to ask me a question about carbon, I'm calling John to the stage. But Midway have been buying some farms in Western Victoria for plantations, and Landline featured an episode on exactly this. I think the issue is that the farmers, I don't think Midway has gone in and offered anything that wasn't being offered by others. Midway have gone into the market, they've purchased land from a very willing seller, and that farmer's happy. Now, I don't know if the implications of that sale have flow-on effects. It was an ex-dairy farm, I think, for the dairy processors in the region. They're valid questions. But at the end of the day, if I was the farmer selling, I want to sell to the person who's going to write me the biggest cheque. And I know that sounds cold, but I don't think there'd be many family farms in Australia that wouldn't do the same. So, yeah.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks for the question online. I do have a question down here from the floor, please.
Yes,
sir.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Yep.
Thanks.
Just wanted to ask the whole panel, open to all. Do you think that economic logic and modelling is capable of capturing the complexity of social and ecological systems and then deriving policy from that is fit for purpose?
Thank you, sir. A good question, and I asked for hard questions. and that's a good question.
Ringing. I better go. Yeah.
So, David, I think this is a brilliant question for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, right? But for me, just because something's complex doesn't mean you try and understand it and try and model it. In a lot of economic modelling, what you're trying to do is understand a complex system and try and distill it down to something to give you some sort of idea about, you know, causal relationships or directional things or whatever. But so I think modelling can certainly help, but you've got to be careful how complex you make your models, because sometimes you try and make your model really, really complex to take account of everything. You're just sort of in this death spiral of you'll never get to the end. So I think there's an art there in trying to find the balance of how complicated do I try and make my model to help provide useful information. But I think there's a role there for modelling still. I mean, of course I'd say that. I've been in economics for 30 odd years. I mean, what else would I say?
Yeah. Thanks,
like
Dave.
a true economic modeller. Ben, if the answer is, can economic modelling cope with the pressures or the demands of the decision making? My answer is no, it can't. Your case study, and I've seen plenty of those in the last 12 months, been in my role. Like I said before, facts and evidence and economic modelling doesn't trump emotion, and some of the impacts of, you know, the sectors we're talking about has community impact, real social impact that is incredibly difficult to model or manage or account for. If someone's lived in a particular place for 100 years, difficult to put a price on that. and to put a number on that and to try and align or adapt to it or match it. So absolutely not. And I think, to Joe's earlier question, the cumulative impact, if you really widen that out, there is more and more, and so there should be, more and more influence or interest in and needs to be assessment of the social impact. Because there'll be a line somewhere where we go, did we get that wrong? Have we got that right? And I think it's better to have that conversation now rather than in 50 years' time and say, geez, we should have thought about that a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, sure. David, and then I'm coming to Sean.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So just on that, I agree with that. People have got different values and different objectives and all the rest of it, but I think that doesn't underscore the need to do modelling or assessments of the trade-off so that if politicians or the powers that be decide, righto, we're going to say we value this particular thing over here, we've got this value set in our mind, it's always useful to know what the trade-offs are. So, yeah, okay, I'm going to follow this path down here and I know that's going to cost me X dollars. I think you're always better off knowing that than just kind of closing your eyes and assuming that, well, that's going to be better than this other thing over here. So I think you need to do both. You've got to take account of the different values people have, but you've also got to have facts and evidence about the trade-offs.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sean.
In the fisheries world, we live with models. Obviously, not being able to just go and directly observe what is happening with fish stocks and ecosystems, we rely on models and more ecosystem models, not just individual or species-specific models. And when you then introduce the social and the economics to those models, it obviously does become more and more complex. But one of the interesting things for anybody that's done this work in fisheries would know that if you're modelling sort of the productivity of a fish stock and you're looking for what the maximum sustainable yield is, it's generally a higher number than if you model the maximum economic yield. So you end up with more conservative harvest levels from wild fish stocks when you introduce the economics. So I think that those are fairly well-trodden paths in the fishery space.
Good point. Look, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to, before we run out of time, because we're in Canberra and because there's a lot of smart people in this room, I want to challenge the panel to talk about what could be, from a public policy sense, done to really move the needle in a positive sense here. But I've got enough time to do that and still make sure that there's not a question from the floor or online. So let's go to one floor, one online. Claire, down here from the floor, please, sir.
G'day. John Lawson. I'm the Carbon Projects Manager at Midway. I guess had a question about, we obviously heard a lot about the opportunity that carbon markets present. I think a lot of the time people don't know what they don't know, and a lot of the time these landholders don't understand the opportunity that's presented by diversifying revenues, by maybe doing different activities on their block, having carbon projects, etc. How do you think we best go about educating them on these opportunities? Nice, easy question for you.
Thank you. Appreciate the question. Anyone like to look at that?
I think that we have to, and this is, again, looking through my own lens, the energy market is incredibly complex, I found, in the last 12 months. Who knew how much more complex than I thought. But this is a big, difficult issue. I think we have forgotten a little bit about telling the story about how and why this is happening, and carbon markets is, I think, similar. So the short answer is more information from people that people trust, and in a way that can be absorbed. Farmers are open to new ideas, the ones that I've known, and they're looking for opportunities, but it's got to be the right format, the right situation. So more communication is the short answer for me.
And at the risk of just vehemently agreeing with you, Tony, it is a good question. I used to live and work in the United States, and there was a survey done. It was about 700 producers in the Midwest. And the question was, why aren't you engaging more in carbon markets? And so if you looked at a pie chart of the results, everyone thought, well, the carbon price is not high enough. Well, yeah, sure, that was a factor. It was a small slither of the pie chart. We're not sure what government policy will be in the future. Yeah, sure, it was a factor. It was a small slither of the pie chart. 70% of that pie chart of why those 700 producers weren't actively engaging more in carbon markets in the US Midwest is because I cannot find education from people I trust. It was an education issue, to your good question, and a trust issue, Tony, to your good point. It's a great point, and something maybe as a sector and the public policy as well, we can do more of. Look, I've got one question, one online.
We heard this morning around, I think, to some extent, Owen Atkin, ANU, about the need to adapt. We've got headwinds coming towards us from climate, etc., and we heard around the need for adaptation. January demonstrated the impact of extreme heat across much of the continent, with 50 degrees Celsius being achieved, near food production areas around Renmark, for example. What are each of your sectors doing in terms of planning to adapt when it's 55 degrees Celsius for 5 days? And that's probably within the next decade or two.
Thanks for the question, Owen. Sean, what's the impact of temperature in your sector? And obviously it's complex.
Yeah. So I mentioned, we've had marine heat waves. I think we've had the hottest sort of records, hottest seasons on record in our oceans in the last couple of years. So, and that's not just in Australia but globally. Really challenging. I think the things like I mentioned before about just trying to build resilience into those natural ecosystems, like restoring native oyster habitats, but also introducing aquaculture for those species that can, if we do have with warming waters more algal blooms, then creating resilience in the ecosystems by having that structure available. But there's a team of scientists in New South Wales, in Port Stephens, where I live, who have developed genetic family lines of oysters that can be resistant to disease, but also can actually survive the sort of doomsday scenarios with the warmest conditions and those scenarios that we want to, hopefully avoid. But those sort of things are available now, and I think we just have to build that resilience into our ecosystems.
Thanks, Sean. Any comments, Di?
Yeah. Resilience for us is key. We invest a lot in genetic stock. Where it's marginal country to plant, I think you wouldn't. Possibly why one of my members is not interested in replanting in that particular area. But the other thing I'd say is we've learnt a lot, particularly I think the last 2 decades particularly, there's been some studies comparing national parks with managed state forest in New South Wales, and they've actually shown that the biodiversity of managed forests is actually superior in many cases to the national parks. Koalas, male koalas, which they follow because they bellow, are doing better in a managed forest than in a national park where drought and fire are having catastrophic impacts. So there's quite a bit of interest in managing well, right tree. I know it's a big plantation on the Tiwis, it's changing variety in the plantation to cope for a changing climate. So, and also managing our pests and weeds as well. That's absolutely essential. Things like giant pane scale, if they get a hold, will make it very difficult to control in a heating climate.
Thanks, Di. Look, I'm going to just hold it there. The fact that we've still got questions online, which we will find out what they are. I'm sure the panel will be interested in those questions, and you may well have more questions from the floor. The fact that we could keep going with questions, I think, is fantastic, and just testament to the panel. Not necessarily the time management of the facilitator. But look, with that, just as we end up in the last couple of minutes, because we're in a room and online with so many public policy people that influence the public policy debate, we've talked a lot about not being a binary discussion. We've talked a lot about a systems approach, structural adjustment, Tony, something that we didn't have a lot of time to go into. You made some good points about that before. But just given some of these challenges, is there anything in particular that you're working on or should be being focused on to really move the needle in a more positive sense And if we can just get some insights from the panel on that, starting with you, Sean, that'd be great to end on a positive, but also put the challenge out there to our colleagues and friends that work in these areas.
Thanks, Ben. I think there's this perception, particularly with wild capture fisheries, that unless we have these highly protected conservation zones, marine parks and sanctuary zones, we can't have sustainable fisheries, and that's simply not true. So there are ways that we can manage fish stocks for sustainable outcomes. And in fact, when you look at some of the best examples of fish stocks that have declined and they've recovered, orange roughy, southern bluefin tuna, we've had grey nose sharks, which are not a fish species, but they were impacted by fishing. All of those stocks are recovering or have fully recovered. So the one thing that I think in the public policy arena that would really help is using threat and risk assessment approaches to identify where the real threats to our ecosystems are, and rather than using sort of broader principles to just sort of essentially sort of lock areas away for conservation, identify what the real threats that are that we're trying to look at. And in New South Wales, that work has been done. Fishing's actually down around number 13 in the number of risks, and the first risk is pollution. Climate change was about number 3, and coastal development was number 2. So just to give you an insight, there are other ways to do it.
Excellent. Good positive note to finish on. Di?
I think I think the forestry industries like being with agriculture and fisheries in terms of feeding and clothing and providing for the planetary needs, especially as we move to decarbonise. So I'd just say let's do more of grow, harvest and repeat.
Thank you, Di. Tony?
2 things for me, Ben. The dis and misinformation, around decommissioning, contamination and fire and all those sorts of things. My objective, and I think, a collective objective should be to address those issues, and so we can have the big discussions about where these, this energy infrastructure goes, because that is making a difficult job much more difficult. The other thing is to maintain, build, rebuild, in some places, trust. And then the government's about to launch a developer rating scheme for generators and transmission companies in the energy sector. So hopefully that goes some way towards rebuilding the trust in some community.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks. And David, do
Yeah,
you want to comment?
for me, very quick one. I mean, it's really just a continuation of some of the things I said earlier about our role in the world is to try and do facts and evidence and all that kind of stuff to inform decisions. And decisions that get made based on whatever objectives or powers that be it have, but we're really focused on trying to inform those as best we can so that sensible decisions are made.
Thank you. Appreciate that, David. Look, I got lucky with my panel members, as you can see, and we finished on time and we still had questions, which shows the level of interest. So I really appreciate the audience engagement, both here and online, and I know the folks on the panel do as well. Could you please join me in thanking David and Tony and Di and Sean?